Breaking right now on Morning News Now, history in the making. President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin set to meet face to face. It is a high-stakes summit focused on trying to end the war in Ukraine. Any moment now, the president is expected to leave the White House for Joint Base Andrews, where he'll board Air Force One and make his way across the country to Alaska. The meeting is set to take place this afternoon at a U.S. military base in Anchorage, where just yesterday, dozens of protesters gathered in support of Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will not take part in today's talks. He and his European allies are warning, don't make any decisions without the Ukrainian leader. President Trump says he is hopeful today will set the stage for a second meeting with both parties present, putting an end to the three-year war.
We're going to see what happens. And I think President Putin will make peace. I think President Zelensky will make peace. We'll see if they can get along. And if they can, it'll be great.
Good morning. I'm Joe Fryer. Savannah is off on this Friday. We have a lot to get to. Let's get right to it with our team of correspondents and analysts as we monitor all the developments from today's summit. Let's start with NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. She joins us now from Anchorage with the latest. Monica, good morning. So over the past 24 hours or so, President Trump seemed to be lowering expectations for this summit, even saying there's a 25% chance of it not going well, and that he's setting the table for meetings later that would include Zelensky. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, exactly, Joe. Remember that candidate Donald Trump promised to end this conflict at the very beginning of his administration if he was going to be elected. Certainly now 3.5 years into this conflict and 7 months into his time in office, that has not been an easy feat. That has certainly been incredibly more challenging. And that is something I think the president, the White House are trying to reflect in the way that they are tempering expectations while saying that this will likely be a multi-step process. And we know that when the president comes face to face with Vladimir Putin today, it will be the first time he is coming to the United States in more than a decade. So we are told he is going to receive a red carpet arrival, which of course will be notable optically in what we're going to see, but that then the leaders will have their own meeting before it expands to a larger meeting with the delegations. And then there's the question of a joint press conference, and what comes out of that is dependent on how the talks go. The president saying that if he doesn't like what he hears, Joe, he's prepared to basically turn around, head back to Washington, and basically maybe start over or give up on this. But this has been something the president has been pushing for, saying that he'll know within the first couple of minutes of looking Vladimir Putin in the eye whether this will be a successful day of talks. Joe.
And the sounds of Alaska offering a soundtrack to your report and to the summit later on today. We should note this is not a traditional summit from years past, where diplomats hammer out the agreements in advance, and the meeting is essentially a big photo op. So walk us through what we do plan to see today.
Yeah, even the Kremlin has said certainly that they're not planning to sign any documents, that there isn't any kind of an agreement that they expect the leaders to walk away with. And I think that is what is so critical here, Joe. And we are going to see, again, some of the fanfare that you would expect to see when President Trump meets with a world leader. But it will be notable that it will be on a U.S. military base, and that, of course, this ends President Putin's isolation since Russia invaded Ukraine. There have been very few places that he can travel to, and certainly there have been many world leaders who have not met with him. So the fact that President Trump will be hosting him here is, of course, going to be a big headline from all of this, the fact just that this meeting is taking place. But then they're going to go through those variations of meetings and then that press conference. But what's notable is that the president has even said if he thinks it goes well, he could call Ukrainian President Zelensky. And he even said yesterday twice he would tell him to come to Alaska, that would be much easier, that they could continue talks here, though, again, we're not really sure if that is a realistic possibility. More likely than not, it sounds like that would take place at a later time, again, if things get on the right track to a potential framework for a ceasefire and a peace deal.
And where a second meeting would take place also would be an interesting point that would have to be hammered out. You mentioned a moment ago, President Trump ran on ending the war, saying he would do it in 24 hours. It has now been 7 months. So politically, what is at stake here for the president?
Yeah, this is certainly an incredibly high-stakes moment. In fact, he just wrote that on his social media platform in all capital letters, high stakes. And as you see the plane there, he's going to be heading here in the next couple of minutes. And what's really significant about this political moment, to your question, Joe, is that this has been a relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that has gone through many different iterations. And remember that at a time, he really praised and felt that he wanted to model himself in the image of Vladimir Putin, in the image of a strong man. And then in the last couple of months, we've really seen a different kind of dynamic where President Trump has said he's been disappointed by him. He's used expletives even to say that they would have a good phone call and then he'd turn around and President Putin would be bombing Ukraine again. So this is a moment where we know, again, politically in the United States, we have seen that shift in the thinking toward Vladimir Putin. But this is also a moment where President Trump has tried to fashion himself as a deal maker. He's pushing for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's talking about that. The White House is bringing that up at sort of every opportunity. So he's the one saying, if I can get a deal, I want to, because I'm somebody who's capable of that. So he's putting a lot on the line here, too, depending on how this all unfolds.
We are keeping an eye on Air Force One sitting there right now at Joint Base Andrews. We expect the president to arrive there within the hour and then take off to Alaska, which is where Monica Alba is reporting for us this morning from Anchorage. Monica, thank you so much. For more on this, let's bring in Kira Rudik. She is a member of parliament in Ukraine. Kira, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us again, as we've spoken with you so many times over these past 3 years. Just what are your thoughts ahead of this high-stakes summit? Are you hopeful at all?
Hello, John. Thank you so much for having me. I would say here on the ground in Ukraine, we are cautiously optimistic. We hope that definitely this is a high-stakes meeting for President Trump and that he cannot afford to be humiliated once again by Putin. He cannot afford to get nothing of this meeting, and he cannot afford to go ahead looking really bad. So he will have to figure it out. And of course, hopes here are that President Trump will get annoyed at Putin. He will see that Putin didn't have any intention to end the war, which he, again, didn't show any sign or here on the ground that he wants to end the war. And that at some point, President Trump will have to go ahead with the promised peace through strength. He will impose the sanctions. He will confiscate the Russian assets, 300 billion of Russian money, and use them for the sake of Ukraine. And he will go ahead with arming Ukraine to the teeth. This was his promise, and this is, we hope, that will happen. We do not believe that somebody can just look Putin in the eye, shake his hand, and end the war. This did not work before. President Trump is not the first person and was the first world leader to try it. And we just do not believe that it is possible to do it this way. However, it is possible to pressure Russia. It is possible to arm Ukraine. And we see the end game here going exactly this way.
Sources tell NBC News President Trump told European leaders during that call on Wednesday he does not intend to discuss any potential divisions of territory when he meets with Putin today. That's despite earlier comments he would do that. Do you trust President Trump will look out for Ukrainian interests today? Are you worried that at least today Europe and President Zelensky are sidelined here?
Yeah, it's actually very concerning because we used to go with this war when there was agreement between the United States, European leaders and Ukraine that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And this is how it was with the previous administration. Right now, this is the first sign that something about Ukraine can be discussed without Ukraine and without Europe. However, Joe, you know, I'm here not so worried about it because I know that in Ukraine, we just will simply not accept something that will not be in Ukraine's interest. And here we are the same people who declined to capitulate in 2022. So we will just not accept something that American president and Russian dictator will figure out between themselves if it not have the end of the war or Ukraine's best interest in mind.
In your mind today for Ukraine, what is the best possible outcome?
That President Trump will go ahead and say, I tried to talk Putin in, he He refused. He was going with all those USSR ideas and restoring Russian Empire. I see that there is no deal can be made with him. So we go ahead with the peace through strength. This is what I think the best outcome is. However, we don't know, and we just want to wish President Trump wisdom and lots of strength here at this meeting. We understand that he's trying to give this diplomatic opportunity a chance. However, again, by the fact that we have seen here on the ground, there is no possibility of the diplomatic solution.
All right. Kira Rudik, we appreciate your time this morning, as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
For more on the international reaction, let's bring in NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. Keir, good morning. We just heard from Keir there about Europeans and Ukrainians being sidelined from today's summit. That has created a lot of nerves among some leaders. International analysts already calling this session a win for Putin just because it's happening, and it's happening on U.S. soil. What more can you tell us about the global optics of this meeting?
Well, Joe, let's just say first that what we heard there from Kira Rudik is how sophisticated, really, the Ukrainian message has become since, for example, that famous Oval Office blow-up with President Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President Vance. What you heard her say there, you know, is we're optimistic. We wish President Trump wisdom. So being supportive of President Trump and then segueing on to make the key points that Ukraine has been making all week about the ways in which Ukraine would not be prepared to compromise. As an example, saying, well, you can't swap territory when the territory is all part of Ukraine. That doesn't make sense. Now, in terms of the question with the Russians, the Russians are arriving with messaging that is, frankly, as maximalist as ever. The message that they are sending is that President Putin is arriving there to explain to President Trump his position. I mean, extraordinarily, you have the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, wearing a USSR shirt as he arrives there. You can't mistake that kind of messaging from the Russians. Ultimately, the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, are still a very, very long way apart. And it's hard to see, as the member of parliament there just suggested, really honestly, it's hard to see how President Trump and President Putin are going to sit down together and kind of resolve that in a way that meetings between President Putin and Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, hours and hours and hours of meetings, haven't achieved. And then just more broadly speaking, the Europeans on the outside watching are going to be, I suspect, ready with their messaging as soon as they understand what's happened in that meeting. And it's really unpredictable. It's very difficult to know. I will say this, and to your point about President Putin having kind of achieved a win simply by having this meeting, I think that's certainly true. And if you look back, if anyone has the time, you need to go back and watch the news conference between President Putin and President Trump. The last time they held a news conference in Helsinki, I mean, President Trump was, in his first term, was hugely criticised for that, for being too understanding of President Putin in that news conference. So, I mean, that's going to be kind of policy making once again in front of the cameras in real time, and there will be people really biting their fingernails in the Trump administration, in Europe, in Ukraine, about how that's going to go.
Yeah, Kira, I want to ask you more about that. I mean, do you get a sense how much is Helsinki on the mind of European leaders as they sit on the sidelines waiting to see how this unfolds? I mean, do they seem confident President Trump is going to stick to the plan?
Well, you know, rhetorically speaking, does President Trump ever stick to a plan? I mean, that's part of his politics, isn't it? That's part of the way he operates. So, I mean, of course, inevitably, in capitals like here in London, where I am, and other European capitals, there will be very, very worried about whether or not he will stick to the plan. But I will say this, and I think it's important, when we come to the end of all of this tonight, and we get the kind of fireworks, something to keep in mind, that's not the end of the story. We've seen that just in the past week where Steve Witkoff met with President Putin. There was an agreement that there should be a meeting. And then you watch the Europeans and the Ukrainians work incredibly hard diplomatically to shift the position and almost to negotiate all the way through this past week, ready for this meeting today. And I think you'll see that again. So what you hear later tonight it will not be the end of the messaging, because immediately the Ukrainians and Europeans will weigh in.
All right. Keir Simmons, as always, we appreciate your time and your reporting. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Now, the true weight of this meeting will be felt in Ukraine, of course, which has endured more than 3 years of war. Russian forces still continue to attack Ukraine using drones and missiles, hoping to seize control of the entire nation. Our NBC News chief international correspondent Richard Engel spoke with Ukrainians about their expectations ahead of today's summit.
Sometimes what you find accidentally is the most revealing. On the outskirts of Kharkiv, we came across a funeral for a Ukrainian soldier killed in a recent Russian attack. They allowed us to film this painful, intimate moment, usually out of sight. Ukraine doesn't like to show its military losses. The soldier's mother grieved, barely able to stand. Her son, Andriy Reshetilov, only recently drafted and sent to the front lines, leaves behind 2 children. I wondered what these people think about a potential ceasefire. The soldier's older brother, Artem, also serving, agreed to speak for everyone.
How are you feeling about the war and peace talks and where all of this is going?
We don't have to compromise with the enemy and give up our beloved land, because this enemy won't stop and will return even stronger, he said.
So even now, as your family is making the ultimate sacrifice, you think there should be no compromise, shouldn't give up any land in exchange for a ceasefire or some sort of peace deal?
Yes, he said, because we know Russia and they never keep agreements. The ceremony was over quickly, perhaps because there was a line.
And even as one funeral is wrapping up, another one is about to begin right next to where the last soldier was buried. Another body is going in.
All the graves marked with flags are for soldiers. We visited a Ukrainian drone base hidden in a garage. The unit's commander, Leonid Maslov, also has little confidence in President Trump's meeting with Putin.
I'm not optimistic. Putin is playing a very bad game. He will deceive Trump for sure. 100%. Trump will be deceived.
Richard Engel, NBC News Now.
And with the world now focused on Alaska, those who live in Anchorage are getting ready to host this high-stakes summit. It's a state with deep ties to Russia. As NBC News Now anchor Gadi Schwartz shows us, those connections go back centuries.
In the far north, America's last frontier might bring natural beauty, midnight sunsets, and frozen wilderness to mind. But so often overlooked is Alaska's long history with Russia and its people now hosting a pivotal moment in geopolitical history.
It's really a fascinating opportunity for Alaska to shine. I think it would also be very exciting for Alaska and for the city of Anchorage to be a part of something like that. I think it's fairly historic.
As Trump and Putin meet in Anchorage, they will be more than 15 times closer to Russia than Washington, D.C. At the closest point on Alaska's coast, Russia and the U.S. are just miles apart. That geography lesson so famously summed up by former Governor Sarah Palin when she ran for the White House in 2008.
They're our next-door neighbors, and you can actually see Russia from land here in Alaska.
The island on the left is Russia. The one on the right is the United States. They're just 2.5 miles apart. But even closer is the historical bond between Alaska and Russia. It was Russians who first settled in Alaska in 1784. And just like the rest of the Americas, their conquest brought massacres and disease to the natives. As a colony of Russia, it was known as Russian America from 1799 to 1867 until, ironically, the Crimean War in Ukraine forced Russia to sell Alaska to the United States for a little more than $7 million to help offset Russians' growing debt. Alaska became a U.S. territory in 1867. But there are still signs of Alaska's Russian past, like these Orthodox churches, with some hoping their historical tie may lead to a future Russian-Ukrainian peace.
Our hope is that God will somehow touch the hearts of those involved, that there will be a valuing of life, a valuing of peace, a valuing of human life in general, and that will lead to a ceasefire and hopefully peace eventually.
Our thanks to Gadi Schwartz for taking us through Alaska's history with Russia. In Washington, D.C., the Trump administration is expanding its authority over D.C. law enforcement. Now the White House is shifting decision-making authority from its police chief to the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced Thursday the Justice Department will name DEA head Terry Cole as Emergency Police Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Department. It's a controversial move facing pushback from district leaders. National Guard troops and federal agents are ramping up their presence, starting 24-hour patrols now around the Capitol. NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez joins us with the latest. Gabe, good morning. So what power does this order give to Terry Cole, and what are we hearing in response from D.C.'s mayor and its AG?
Well, hi there, Joe. Well, it's a remarkable power struggle here in the nation's capital. Up until now, you had heard mostly a cooperative tone from district officials with regards to the federal takeover of the police department. But as you mentioned, now Attorney General Pam Bondi has appointed the DEA Administrator Terry Cole as the, quote, Emergency Police Commissioner. Essentially, he is leading the police department. However, D.C. officials say not so fast. The D.C. Attorney General basically is saying that the order is unlawful and that city leaders they don't have to follow it. The mayor as well is also pushing back on this. This will likely end up in the courts. But again, a remarkable power struggle. And right now it is sort of unclear who is actually leading the D.C. Police Department, Joe.
And this announcement comes as the president claims the military presence is already working. What is he saying and what is actually happening on the ground?
Well, listen, it's very interesting. You speak with residents here in D.C., the reaction is mixed. We spoke with one community activist who has been here for decades and is part of a neighborhood watch program, has led it. He was very supportive of the federal takeover of the police department and says the increased presence by federal resources that you see right there on the screen is very welcome, that crime, in his view, has dropped over the last several days. However, there are others who say that this essentially amounts to authoritarianism, that the feds are coming in and taking over the police department when they shouldn't. Now, yesterday I was in the Oval Office when President Trump spoke about this. Listen to what he had to say.
People are so happy to see our military going into D.C. and getting these thugs out. As you know, we arrested a lot of people yesterday. We arrested a lot of people today. Washington, D.C. is at its worst point, and it will soon be at its best point. You're going to have a very safe, you're going to have a crime-free city.
Now, look, the White House saying that overnight, the night before, there were a total of about 45 arrests by federal agents. That, when you compare it to the average that the D.C. Metro Police does on any given night, they average around 67 or so each night. So it's questionable whether the federal resources have made a huge difference in terms of arrest. However, the White House and the president also mentioning that this has been a huge deterrent effect. So, again, the Trump administration arguing that this is already working, Joe.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's probably going to take some time to actually see what the numbers say before we can make any assessments, because any number can go one way or the other. You mentioned there are some people in the city who do actually welcome this, but we also know there are some who don't. There's been some pushback. What are you hearing there?
Well, yes, and as I mentioned earlier, the D.C. city officials, up until now, had struck this cooperative term. Mayor Bowser had been arguing that she was powerless to turn down this federal help and in some ways wanted to work with the federal government to address the issue of crime in D.C., which, like many major cities, has had to deal with it over the last few years, although crime statistics do show that crime had been on the way down. The Trump administration argues that those numbers have been manipulated, so even that is a huge debate at this point. But yesterday, Joe, there was that protest, more than 100 protesters that had gathered at a commercial residential area here in D.C. When local police, along with federal agents, had set up a checkpoint that you saw right there. Those protesters heckled the law enforcement officers. There was at least one arrest. And then also there was another incident earlier in the week where a man threw a Subway sandwich at a federal officer. You see the aftermath right there. He then ran away. Police arrested him. They received the video that essentially went viral. You see him throwing that sandwich at that federal officer. Well, yesterday we learned, according to the Attorney General, that that man actually worked at the Department of Justice, and the Attorney General says that he's since been fired.
All right. Gabe Gutierrez reporting from the White House. Gabe, thank you so much. Florida is set to open its second immigration detention center. At a news conference Thursday, Governor Ron DeSantis said the new facility will open in the Baker Correctional Institution, which is about 45 miles west of Jacksonville. It'll hold about 1,300 detainees. The facility, which he nicknamed the Deportation Depot, follows the opening of the so-called Alligator Alcatraz in the Everglades last month. DeSantis says the new facility will open soon, but he did not give an exact timeline. More scorching temperatures are in the forecast for this weekend, prompting heat alerts throughout the Midwest and southeastern parts of the country. Meteorologists are also keeping an eye on Tropical Storm Erin, which is still pretty far out to sea, though it's picking up steam. Forecasters say it's expected to become a major hurricane over the weekend. And out west, more evacuation orders are in place with wildfires breaking out across a number of states. This fire in northern Utah has forced hundreds of people to evacuate their homes. In California, evacuation orders are in place in northern Los Angeles County after this brush fire consumed some 500 acres in a matter of hours. Let's get more on the severe conditions with your Morning News Now weather. Meteorologist Michelle Grossman joins us now. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. And yeah, the heat does continue. So does the storm chances, not only today, but tomorrow and also Sunday. Starting with the heat, because we do have extreme heat in some spots. 50 million people impacted today from Omaha to Oklahoma City, Jackson, New Orleans, Tallahassee, down to Tampa. And we're going to see those temperatures soaring once again into the 90s. And then humidity plays a big role today because we're going to see heat indices 105 to 110 in some spots. So taking a look at some of these numbers into the 90s in Kansas City, factoring that humidity, feeling like 104. It's going to feel like 106 in Memphis, feeling like 108 in Savannah. That will be the same story as we go throughout tomorrow as well. Weekend storms, not only today, we're looking at showers and storms in the southeast because of that heat and humidity and because of this triggering stationary front. Good news, though, to the northeast, New England, parts of the northeast, less humid. You're going to feel that. You felt that yesterday later on in the day. You're going to feel that once again today. So that's a good part of today. Then tomorrow, we're looking at a few storms rumbling into the Midwest. There's that front right there stretched across portions of the Midwest and Great Lakes. So we'll see a flood risk once again from Minnesota east to Michigan. Sunday, another storm chance in the northeast. We're going to see that front sink a little bit further to the south, a little bit further to the east, and that's going to bring those storm chances. Where you see these dots here, that's the futurecast showing us where we think any of these storms will show up. But you want to bring the umbrella because they can pop up anywhere, really. Storms likely from Maine to Minnesota. Storm threat today, that would mainly be confined to portions of the upper Midwest. That includes Minneapolis, Eau Claire, down to La Crosse. Winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour, damaging hail. A tornado or two is possible. They should be on the brief side, but could see some heavy downpours also. Tracking Erin, it is a very strong storm at this point. 70 miles per hour, a strong tropical storm, I should say. Moving northwest at 17 miles per hour. It's moving into favorable conditions. So we do expect it to strengthen to a Category 1 storm today. And then look how it blossoms. It's kind of getting into that really warm air. It doesn't have wind shear, dry air to tear it apart. So by Sunday, we're looking at even late Saturday, we could see a major storm at a Category 3 storm with winds at 115 miles per hour. Monday, Category 4 storms with winds at 130 miles per hour. Joe, the good news right now is all the models are showing that it's going to curve off to the north and east. Could affect Bermuda. That's still in the question, but the East Coast looks good right now, with the exception of some life-threatening surf and also rip tides. But we're going to watch it, of course.
Of course, and that's the last thing we need right now is a hurricane on the East Coast. So that's a bit of a relief. Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate it.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.